This is the FarmDoc webinar. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason, coming to you from the farm field today. I'll get rid of this background noise in just a bit. The corn, by the way, is really good here in Logan County. We're running about 19 to 20%. We're in our fourth day of harvest corn. Thank you for bearing with me today. We're going to talk with the FarmDoc team. Krista Swanson is here, along with Jonathan Kappas, about the Inflation Reduction Act, and they'll take you through all the next hour or so. I'm going to pop off after this, so I won't be back. But thank you again for joining us. Good morning to you, Krista, and good morning to you as well, Jonathan. Thanks for being there on the Mumford Hall campus at the University of Illinois in the building there.
Well, thank you, Todd. This is Jonathan Kappas, coming from the basement studio of Jim Bolts, who always runs these webinars for us. And Krista's joining us remotely. And Todd, thank you again for helping kick us off from the field. As mentioned, we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act today. Krista, you want to make sure we got all sound and capabilities ready to go?
Yep, sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Krista Swanson, and I'm here from our farm in Knox County, although I'm not out on the farm like Todd is. So good morning, everyone.
All right, so we're going to kick this off by delving into a little bit of the strange oddities that brought about the Inflation Reduction Act. So a little bit of background for those of you who enjoy your federal statutes and budget legislation. This is a reconciliation bill, which is the authority for doing reconciliation is found in the federal budget statute you see before you. The way it works is the House and Senate budget committees can include reconciliation instructions in the annual budget resolution. Both House and Senate have to agree on the budget resolution, but it is not signed into law by the president. So this is just an agreement between the two chambers on what the budget parameters will be that they're going to work on. And stuck within that or included within that are these instructions. And that's up to the budget committees and how they do this. But typically what we do is the budget reconciliation instructions will tell committees of Congress, so committees such as the Senate Ag Committee and the House Ag Committee, to take action related to the budget under their jurisdiction. So usually things like increase or decrease spending on programs and policies within their jurisdiction. And then it gets rolled into or compiled into a single omnibus bill that is then pushed through Congress under special rules. So, for example, there are no filibuster or cloture requirements in the Senate. So this runs under its own set of procedural rules in the chambers. One of the key rules that have to be dealt with in a budget reconciliation process, which also, frankly, impacts the way the legislation gets written, is something known as the Byrd Rule, named for late Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia. And what this is that this is a special rule for reconciliation that keeps it tied to budgetary matters. So we're using something called budget reconciliation. They want to avoid having what's called extraneous matters in the legislation. So under the Byrd Rule, things that do not produce a change in outlays or revenues, if they don't meet the instructions or if the provision is not within the jurisdiction of the committee, those are the kind of things we consider extraneous to the budget reconciliation, would be subject to points of order and be pulled out of the bill or prevented from being in the bill in the first place. We also consider anything extraneous if it's merely incidental to the non-budgetary components. So if there's a minor change in budgetary matters, but it's incidental, and it looks like it's a big policy move. So what you won't typically see in one of these in reconciliation bills are large and different or new policies. And then anything that changes outlays or revenues beyond the fiscal years covered in the reconciliation instruction, or it would also violate the Byrd Rule and have to be taken out of the bill. So what you see is kind of the way this rule contains the provisions of a reconciliation legislation. It sort of puts limits or parameters around what the committees can do under the instructions they're given for reconciliation. And so that really matters in terms of what the bill is able to deal with and sort of the topics and the time frame. just to give a little bit of the legislative history of this, the budget resolution, Senate Resolution 14, covered fiscal years 2023 through 2031. It passed on August 24th of 2021. Within that were instructions to the Senate Ag Committee to report changes that did not report changes under their jurisdiction that increased the deficit by not more than $135 billion through 2031. And of course, this is what then led to nearly a year's worth of negotiations to produce the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law by President Biden on August 16th. So that's kind of a quick overview of the steps that Congress went through since over the last year plus to achieve this legislation. And with that, I think, Krista, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about some of the top line numbers.
Yeah, so the table shown here is really the bigger picture summary of what is included in this entire bill as reported by, it's a compilation of scores from the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. So in the left side, we have expenditures or where the money is going. The right column includes revenues or the ways the government plans to bring in money. So I'm gonna highlight a few here of the provisions that are maybe of most interest to agriculture. So there's $34.7 billion in spending for the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. As Jonathan was kind of just explaining, where they have instructions of how to utilize those funds and funds to use by that committee. There's $33 billion in spending in the form of tax credits for clean vehicles and transportation fuels, and $66 billion in spending in tax credits for clean energy and fuels. And we'll talk more about those in a minute. There's also $80 billion expenditure for the Internal Revenue Service, but this is on the revenue side because that spending is expected to generate $204 billion in additional taxes collected. So that results in a net revenue of $124 billion. And we can talk a bit about that more later as well. So starting here with an overview of tax credits related to vehicles and fuels in general, and then breaking down what's in that $33 billion for clean vehicles and transportation fuels, and the $66 billion available in tax credits for clean electricity and fuel. So that chart on the left side includes tax credits for both new and pre-owned clean vehicles, both for personal use and commercial or business use. So depending on what whether you would be buying on behalf of a personal property or a business or farm, there's opportunities there. There's also a alternative fuel refueling credit, and that was something that existed in the past for alternative fuels like ethanol and natural gas and LP and hydrogen fuels. But that was also expanded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So the tax credit was added to, and it also was expanded to include electric charging stations as well. And so again, this is refueling property for refueling of these fuels. And again, that can also be residential or personal use or commercial or business use. On the right side, the credits are related to clean energy production. This includes alternative fuels like biofuels and renewable diesel. Also included here is a sustainable aviation fuel for the first time, which is something that's a opportunity area for agriculture. And so these credits, the spending for these credits is, or the utilization of these credits is expected to increase over that period from 2023 to 2031. And this slide is just really a highlight of some of the things from the previous two slides, but some renewable energy highlights are the extension of a biodiesel income tax credit for those fuels. That goes through 2024 now. That was extended a couple years. There's also a number of renewable energy credits that are either added to or extended, including those specific to rural areas. I will note that because in rural areas around where I live, I've noticed a lot of residential energy projects, including solar. So a few notes on those for anyone looking into residential solar. The incentive was scheduled to drop down to 26% credit in 2022, and then further to 22% in 23 before ending entirely. The Inflation Reduction Act moved that back up to 30% for all solar projects installed from 2022 through the end of 2032. And so that, 4% difference may not seem like a lot from a percentage standpoint, but as an example, that difference, if you were putting in a $60,000 solar project, would be the difference of an additional $2,400 available in the form of a credit, which is a important difference there. And so it also adds funds to the Rural Energy for America program, or commonly known as the acronym REAP, R-E-A-P. And this provides the opportunity. This was a Farm Bill program that additional funds have been added to. And this provides the opportunity for a grant. You can apply for a grant for rural energy projects, including those on farms are eligible to apply for that. And then I mentioned earlier the addition of a new credit for sustainable aviation fuel. So again, these were just a few of the highlights that may be of higher interest to some of our farmer listeners here.
Thanks.
Jonathan.
I was thinking about as Jim's plugging and unplugging equipment. One of the things that dawned on me as we look at some of these, obviously, I think everybody knows that a lot of this is just estimated costs, and certainly some of this will be subject to change, including the estimates. And so what we have been producing or providing are the scores and estimated costs of these things as we know them now. For those that really like to follow the numbers, we'll update when more information is provided. So I sometimes forget to put that caveat in on all the numbers, but that is a great overview. Krista, thanks on the potential of these tax credits to help further renewable energy and fuels and alternative fuels. We're not going to delve too deep into this, but I'm going to kind of just cover a bit of the IRS provisions because they have attracted a lot of attention, as one would probably expect with anything to do with the Internal Revenue Service. As Krista mentioned on the top line, there was about $80 billion appropriated to the IRS for enforcement and other activities. The expectation for that is that it will increase tax collections to the tune of $204 billion over the 10-year window. So what we see then is this $80 billion investment or appropriation would net out about $124 billion in funding, which contributes to deficit reduction efforts. Breaking down what has been provided or appropriated and what it's designed for, there's about $3.2 billion to help with taxpayer services. Again, just helping everybody deal with IRS paperwork and get their taxes paid. So this will help improve the service capacity of the IRS. Another $4.75 billion for business systems modernization. And again, I think we can all appreciate this investment to help improve service and help modernize the systems. For those of you that follow this sort of thing, you probably know many of the horror stories with their IT systems and the challenges they have just operating because of underfunding in previous years. So makes life tough, and we don't need additional complications with something like paying taxes. Of course, there's a $25.3 billion investment in operations support, again, taxpayer services, and this includes the enforcement programs. And finally, the $45.6 billion in enforcement. And this is investing in the IRS and IRS capacity, and individuals. So this is where you see things like hiring thousands of new employees, And the goal is, as indicated by both Congress and the administration, is to step up the enforcement activities and the ability of IRS to go after people who have not paid their taxes, who have cheated on their taxes, or otherwise avoided them, and make sure that those individuals are paying the taxes. And so, combined, these investments are intended then to improve tax collections and cut down on tax avoidance, and help reduce the deficit by making sure everybody pays what they're supposed to pay according to our tax laws. All right, jumping from the joys of the IRS to the Ag Committee work, and some of this Chris has already highlighted. The $34.7 billion for the Ag Nutrition and Forestry Senate Ag Nutrition and Forestry Committee, or the House Agriculture Committee, and this, we're just comparing it here on this slide to some of the other committees who also had funding in this reconciliation bill. So the big three, obviously, are Agriculture, Energy and Natural Resources, and then the Environment Public Works Committee, all of them roughly in that $35 billion range, and then some other funding items as well. Just delving into the Ag Committee bucket a bit further, the total funding breaks down as you see it here on the left of the screen. About 44.5% of the total funds went to the conservation programs of the Farm Bill, and another 30.5% to rural development. You can see the appropriations breakdown, and this is where maybe we should step into the sort of weeds a little bit of how this reconciliation legislation works for these programs. Fiscal year 2022 obviously has this large infusion of cash that includes the rural development funding, that includes the conservation program funding. And the way it's written, these are funds provided as early as fiscal year 2022, which, for those of you that pay attention to this, that this current fiscal year ends tomorrow. But these are funds made available to USDA throughout the window. So the funding that you see in 2022 does not go away after tomorrow. It's just becomes first available in the current fiscal year and remains available through 2031. As we'll dig into a little bit more, the conservation program set up slightly different. There is a pot of money right away that's available. And then there are specific multi-year appropriations for the fiscal years 2023 through 2026. And rural development has a little bit of that as well. But what this is that this is budget authority provided each fiscal year that remains available through the window, so through 2031. So this is not fundings just for that fiscal year in which it's provided. It does stay available for multiple years through 2031. It just becomes available in the fiscal year as appropriated. So one of the questions I think we got as people signed up for the program, and that comes up all the time, is just kind of trying to understand this, because one of the things that's unique about a farm bill, as many of you know, is that it operates mandatory spending programs. So these are not programs that rely on the annual appropriations process, but have funds provided mandatorily throughout the life of the farm bill. This is an attempt to try and kind of show that a little bit, and it's a little confusing, and it may not be, whether it's the best way to show it or not, I guess is up to everybody. The mandatory spending in a farm bill. So what the farm bill authorizes through 2023 for conservation programs and Title I commodity payment programs, all of the funding for that comes out of the Commodity Credit Corporation. And that is that $30 billion a year direct line of credit that USDA operates and that Congress authorizes to be used to make farm program payments, the marketing assistance loans, disaster payments, and then, of course, the conservation programs. So if you think about the way this works under budget rules, we estimate those as outlays every fiscal year based on what Congress authorized. And so the bottom set of bars here on this screen in front of you are the existing conservation programs as authorized in the 2018 Farm Bill and as scored by the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, for the baseline window. And this comes from the May 2022 CBO baseline forecast. So those bottom set of bars are the baseline for conservation, for Title II. This is what CBO expects those programs to spend. That's called outlays in their baseline estimates. That's what they're forecasting for those programs, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, both the 2014 version, which is sunsetting over time, and then the revisions in 2018. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, and then the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So that's what CBO says those programs are expected to spend. It is that estimate that drives the baseline for a farm bill discussion, that drives the 10-year baseline estimates. Then what we've got on top of that are the Inflation Reduction Act budget authority appropriations in that bill. These are not into the baseline. These are also not outlays. This is not what CBO expects them to spend. We're actually waiting for CBO to give an updated score of this. These are the amounts appropriated in the text. So each fiscal year, we see an increasing total amount of budget authority provided for these programs, but we do not have the outlay windows, if you will, the outlay schedule, like how much of that in each fiscal year will be spent. So we can't quite add it the way we couldn't quite add it to the bars and the baseline. And more importantly, because this is a separate line of spending, a separate appropriation, these are not commodity credit corporation. These are not commodity credit corporation mandatory funds. So these are also not baseline dollars. This is a separate set of appropriations, the spending for which the authority to outlay those ends in 2031. So eventually we will work to update this when we have better estimates from CBO on exactly how they think these things are going to spend out. The other note on these programs, on the money provided to these programs, the existing conservation programs, EQIP, CSP, ACEP, and RCPP, there are provisions in each one of the components of the Inflation Reduction Act that provides this funding, that instructs the secretary that all of the spending provided under that, so the additional spending from the Inflation Reduction Act, is limited to, or sort of contained, or the parameters around that spending is for one or more agricultural conservation practices or enhancements that the secretary determines will improve soil carbon, reduce nitrogen losses, reduce, capture, avoid, or sequester carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide emissions that is associated with agricultural production. So what this is just a reminder that these additional funds are not for all conservation practices. This is not for the entire authorized Farm Bill set of practices and enhancements, but really focusing in on those things that help with climate change, that help address greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, or help farmers and agricultural operations sequester or capture greenhouse gases, all in that effort to help agriculture help address climate change. Again, just kind of highlighting all of these issues to kind of put us in context a little bit. This is the May 2022 CBO baseline that we put out on the farmdoc a while back when it was released. Just a reminder, this is what the committees will have to work with in baseline funding, Title I, Title II conservation, crop insurance, and then the large item for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. It used to be known as food stamps. And as we've talked about many times, when the committees go in to reauthorize the Farm Bill, if they do so in 2023, as it's scheduled to expire, this is the pot of money. This is what they have to work with. Under budget rules, you can't spend above your baseline in the 10-year window. So this is kind of what they have to work with. It's yet to be determined exactly how the new budget authority will spend out, and how the new items for the conservation programs, the new funding appropriated for the conservation programs, will impact or alter or influence the way Congress works under its baseline rules. Again, just kind of highlighting the baseline for conservation programs here as it exists. And again, it'll be next year's baseline that will control any Farm Bill reauthorization effort in 2023. So coming back to this slide, just to give you kind of the come full circle on the baseline and spending items. Again, what we're looking at from the Inflation Reduction Act is not an increase in the mandatory spending for conservation programs under the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation. It is a separate appropriated amount into those programs over the course of those fiscal years, the spending of which has yet to be scored. And then finally, just to give you the program by program breakdown of what was provided in the Inflation Reduction Act to these conservation programs in terms of additional spending. There's funding in there that begins for fiscal year 2022, most of that for technical assistance, $1 billion for technical assistance, about $300 million to quantify greenhouse gas emissions and reductions and really help kind of step up or push progress on being able to measure and validate and verify what's going on. And then you see the main conservation programs that receive funding. So the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Programs received the largest share of the appropriations each year. ASEP, the Conservation Easement Program, and the Conservation Stewardship Program also got significant additions in funding. And then here on the side, this is one of the oddities, if you will, or one of the sort of unique aspects that had to come through the reconciliation process. If you go back to all of the first couple of slides in which we talk about how reconciliation works, the instructions to the committee, and the Byrd rule that keeps things within, the sort of the parameters of what is expected for reconciliation, that helps us understand why there are provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that extend the conservation programs. And so this is something that, and again, I apologize for what may be confusing kind of inside the esoteria of legislation. But if you recall what we said about farm bills, so the 2018 Farm Bill is authorized through 2023. That authorization is used to set the baseline for the next farm bill. And so the way that works, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is instructed under the statute to take the estimated spending, what they forecast those programs to spend in fiscal year 2023 when they expire, and extend it out over 10 years. When Congress comes in with the Inflation Reduction Act and appropriates the additional spending, it has to put limits and restrictions on that spending so it does not alter that baseline, because the way the baseline works is it runs spending into perpetuity under the assumptions of the budget law. So you can't, because reconciliation doesn't allow you to be outside the 2031 window, you can't change spending beyond 2031, which means you cannot actually change the baseline. But budget rules require the last year of the authorization to run into perpetuity. That strange sort of confusing conflict amongst the different statutes is why you see within the Inflation Reduction Act these extensions. So what the Inflation Reduction Act did, in addition to providing the additional funding for the programs, is it extended the authorities for those programs through 2031 to make sure that everything matches up under the budget law and we're not outside the Byrd rule and not causing any of the other problems with these two programs working together. And again, I know that's confusing. Believe me, it is no fun exercise to untangle, but there have been questions that have come up about, well, why is this extension text in the Inflation Reduction Act? And that is why. It's really just trying to thread the needle between the way mandatory programs work in a farm bill, the way the budget rules set up for baseline estimates of those mandatory programs, and the specific rules and, frankly, limits on reconciliation language. So where those all meet, you have to find a way to thread that needle and get the funding appropriated without interfering with the way the baseline works through an entire 10-year window. I don't know if that further confuses anybody or clears anything up, but we're certainly happy to take questions on that as we get through this stuff. Just some highlights again on the total amount appropriated through the Inflation Reduction Act and the by program. So we just, again, EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, received the lion's share of this funding, followed by the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And again, an attempt to just sort of break down or understand some of the conservation spending. We're adding appropriated dollars, or what's called the budget authority. We are still waiting to get estimates on exactly how those will outlay over the lifetime of this through 2031. We talked about the wonderful challenges keeping all this together. And of course, our new fiscal year begins next week. New era and ability to address conservation needs. This is just kind of a highlight, sort of reminding that two things. We've added funding to these programs, which are historically and perpetually and persistently oversubscribed. I think it's, like less than 30% of the applications that go into EQIP are actually funded. And those are applications that have been approved that they would normally receive funding. So this is an important investment in conservation and helping clear backlogs, but it's also driving the funding toward climate change based efforts. And so this is the potential, if you will. This opens up a real potential for new thinking around conservation, new investments in conservation. It's pretty historic to do this, particularly outside of a farm bill. And it's historic in the long history of farm bills that we see a dedicated effort to fund up the conservation programs on their own and of their own, rather than something like in 2002 when the additional funding was provided across the board. And most of it went to Title I commodity payments. So this is unique. It opens the potential for a new era, a new focus, and a new emphasis on conservation and on the climate change potential in agriculture, as well as the risks and resiliency issues in the face of climate change. Krista, back over to you, maybe with another highlight of the tax credit, and then we can start to get the questions here in just a minute.
Yeah, so I covered tax credits some earlier, but just kind of a wrap up and a few more notes on those. So again, there's over $370 billion in new energy related tax credits. I talked about two specific areas of those credits earlier, but there's creation of tax credits for adopting electric vehicles, again, extending tax credits for nuclear energy and other low carbon technologies. And then I dove into this a little bit earlier off script, but it extended and expanded support for energy investments, and that is for both real estate owners and homeowners. I talked about that a little bit with changes in the parameters and expanding the ability to capture credits for energy efficient investments and including solar. And then one note here is that some of these credits have qualifications or requirements that are needed in order to capture the credit. So if you are doing a renewable energy project or buying a new car and you are intending to or hoping to use that credit, just a note to make sure that what you are doing does qualify. There's some income. Some of these credits have income phase outs. Some of them are dependent on the location in which the item was produced, like for electric cars, for instance, have to be made in the United States. And then also there's some differences in credits available depending on the use of prevailing wage labor versus other. And so again, making sure that what you are doing qualifies for your intended credit. And then a few notes on paying for the Inflation Reduction Act. So Jonathan talked some about the changes to the IRS. I did want to note that some of the proposed tax provisions that were proposed in earlier pieces of legislation over the past year or so that we've talked about in other farmdoc webinars and other farmdoc articles were not included. Some of the things like eliminating the automatic step up in basis on the transfer of real estate property, estate tax thresholds, higher capital gains taxes. So some of these were concerning to the agricultural community and farmers, and those were not included in this. So if we weren't going down those roads as previous proposed legislation had put out there, how is this being paid for? There was some reform of the Medicare prescription drug program that makes up a large portion of the revenue. If you go back and look at that, one of the first few slides we had up, there's also a 15% minimum tax on corporations with income over $1 billion. This will not directly affect any farms. there was a 2-year extension of excess business loss limitations. So there's a provision that allows businesses to carry back losses. That is something that farmers do occasionally use, although with a good tax planner and working through some of those types of things, you can often plan ahead. But there are situations such as with major livestock disease or a situation like that where maybe you have a very large unexpected loss that wasn't something that you were prepared for. This is extending a limit on the amount that you can carry back that loss. So that could impact some farmers. This spending, and then again, Jonathan already went into greater detail on the Internal Revenue Service changes. This could likely mean increased audits. So just a note for farmers and farm business owners out there, to be diligent in your farm and business record keeping. The way I look at this is if you're doing a good job and following the rules, you shouldn't have much to worry about in that regard. So again, another plug for having a good tax accountant is important. And that's where what we had planned ended. I don't think Todd is still with us, so I guess I can go ahead and move into, before we take questions, putting up a plug-in for our upcoming webinars. Next week on October 6th, you can hear about Brazilian agriculture in 2022 and 23, what to expect for acreage with Joanna Calusi and Gary Schnicke. The following week on October 13th, we have machinery investments and farm financial trends with Brad Zwilling of the FBFM. We have, I guess I don't know what Todd normally says here, Jonathan. I know we jump ahead to the next slide.
We want to thank, the main thing, before we get to some questions, is just really say thanks to our partners and obviously here at the University of Illinois and with FBFM. And a big thank you to all the sponsors of FarmDoc and our FarmDoc webinar series. You can see them there on the screen with their logos. Really, really appreciate all the contributions and feedback and work that we've had with everybody. So we continue to appreciate all of that. And with that, I believe we go to question time. Jim's telling me to move to the next slide. So there we go. Now we're into the question session, part of this webinar session. So please, if you have them, type them in and send them. Jim's figured out the glitch with our one screen, and so I can read them now. We've got questions back up in front of us, and I'll walk through those as we go. One thing I was going to note, Krista, back on the IRS piece, I don't see the question up there now. I do believe the administration has been pretty clear that nobody, those extra enforcement attention, if you will, or efforts and audits, they're looking to keep that above the $400,000 income mark. So kind of keeping in the same line with a lot of the other proposals and campaign discussions. So again, be diligent, but I don't know how many would fall within that category to begin with. So let's move back into some of the questions, and we start with the baseline for the 2023 Farm Bill. When will it be known? And that's a good question. We don't know. Typically, the Congressional Budget Office releases that baseline in February, sometimes March of the year. As you can tell from the screens, last year's baseline didn't come out till May. So it kind of depends just on what's all going on. There's a whole process by which the administration has to submit its budget. It's supposed to do so in the first week of February, and then CBO does its scoring estimates after that. For years, we've had delays and other kind of technical challenges and political challenges of getting all that through. So I don't know. We'd look for it early in the spring, but it is that baseline. So if Congress is going to reauthorize the Farm Bill in 2023, which is what is scheduled to be completed, it is the baseline estimates that CBO releases in 2023. Usually late winter, early spring, those baseline estimates come out. That's what controls the Farm Bill debate in terms of baseline. The next question we had up was explaining the decrease in the baseline for SNAP in the first couple of years. And what I understand that to be is mostly around the pandemic, the COVID-19 response, and the additional funding, additional benefits, and assistance that was provided during the pandemic through some of the pandemic relief legislation. And so I believe that sunsets out, and that's why you see a decrease in spending. Yet to be really unpacked in the SNAP baseline is the impact that inflation is having on those costs. Remember, that's SNAP provides direct assistance to low-income individuals and families to purchase food. And so clearly inflationary pressures on food prices are going to get factored into SNAP. And I don't have an answer as to sort of how that breaks out. But I believe most of the fall off in the baseline spending for that program is the sunsetting of that pandemic, the boost in funding and assistance for the pandemic. Let's see. Do we believe this Inflation Reduction Act conservation funding will create less incentive to get a 2023 Farm Bill done on time? That's a great question. I don't think it of itself creates the funding that is going to sort of be a blocker to getting a farm bill done. I think the challenges for getting a farm bill done in 2023 are many and are not linked to or not the result of the IRA. In some sense, when we look back over this, one of the things that's concerned us with the 2023 Farm Bill debate all along has been the challenge with writing farm bills under a baseline set of limitations. And so this, in some sense, the funding could very much help because we are investing in conservation programs. It may help kind of ease some of the pressure and some of the burden for those programs, particularly things like the frustration with backlogs and the increased demand for those programs. So in some senses, it could help. But I think the challenges for a 2023 Farm Bill extend far beyond the funding provided by the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think we'll kind of have to wait and see how some things unfold between now and 2023. Next question. What does it mean for conservation programs baseline funding? Will they need to be appropriated annually or automatically come out of the CCC? Okay, so here's where we may have gotten lost in the thicket of budget reconciliation and baseline and budgetary rules. So the Inflation Reduction Act funding is itself an appropriation. It's written as an appropriation, and it is appropriated by fiscal year for the conservation programs. So there is, X billion dollars in fiscal year 2025 for EQIP, for example. So there is no need for an annual appropriation to release those funds, if you will. Those funds are available in the fiscal year. They are already appropriated in their multi-year appropriations. So those funds are appropriated in the fiscal year and they remain available until 2031, or to the end of the fiscal year in 2031. Now, the difference is that they are not out of the Commodity Credit Corporation. And that's where we have this sort of weird kind of collision between the CCC mandatory funding authorized in a farm bill and the appropriated funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of the limits and rules for budgeting baseline and for reconciliation spending. And so it's because of that we saw some of the extension text and some of the other sort of oddities. But these are not CCC mandatory dollars. In that sense, they would not be expected to. We haven't seen CBO update its baseline numbers. They would not be expected to be in that baseline $5 to $6 billion for conservation programs, again, because they are appropriated outside of the CCC mandatory authorization. So, just to make this more confusing, the additional billions appropriated to EQIP go into the EQIP program, but not into the CCC mandatory baseline numbers. So they will be used for EQIP practices so long as they meet the restrictions around climate change and related issues, or practices that the Secretary determines will meet that criteria. That is through the EQIP authorization. That is through the EQIP program and practices and regulations. But it is not out of the CCC, so it is not funding from that. It is a separate multi-year appropriation. I hope that clears it up. I don't know that I have a better way of explaining it, but certainly if we still have confusion, I'm happy to try again. I sympathize with everybody who feels like they maybe are tangled up in some strange legislative stuff right there. How about we move to another one? If more questions come up, Jim will let me know. Let's see. What can we expect for forest and floodplain easements, dam removal, and other conservation measures related to protecting or enhancing water quality? So that's a great question. And I think the first part of the answer is, well, not 100% clear or certain. USDA has not provided any information yet on how they will implement the additional funding. I think some of these items like dam removal and some of those things, what I would say is that one, they probably don't fall under the criteria for the Inflation Reduction Act. But if you think about overall funding, so if we have backlogs, I'm going to take EQIP again as a simple example. We have a significant backlog of EQIP applications that have been approved but not funded because there's just not enough funding provided in the Farm Bill for that program. So what this funding can do is free up some of that. It can pick up some of those backlog applications, for example. So let's say I got applications in there that are for practices that the Secretary determines meet the criteria for climate change. Those could be funded out of the Inflation Reduction Act appropriated dollars in the years that they're provided. Those are now applications no longer in the backlog or no longer seeking the limited pot of funding from the Farm Bill, which may free up some of that Farm Bill mandatory money then for other practices and programs that do not meet the Inflation Act criteria. So you can think of it as kind of freeing up some of that and maybe helping release some of the pressure or restrictions on that. So to your question, though, something like maybe dam removal doesn't get funded under the Inflation Reduction Act pot of money, but may now have a better chance of getting mandatory CCC funding through the Farm Bill program because we've opened up some of that. So it's indirect, but it may help. Again, a lot remains to be determined on exactly how that's going to operate through NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I do not envy them. There are no small set of challenges working through that. But I do think that for those who are interested in conservation practices that may not fit the Inflation Reduction Act criteria, I don't think it's a loss. I think you're seeing it free up funding elsewhere and free up some of the mandatory money in a Farm Bill. So I think there's a lot of potential in that sense. And I may have answered this already. How will NRCS implement working lands conservation with the new Inflation Reduction Act billions and additional funding? So they will clearly address climate disruption as Congress intended. And that's a great question. So here again, we kind of we find ourselves sort of threading needles in the wonderful esoteria of federal policy. We would not expect NRCS to have to, write new regulations and go through the whole regulatory process because these are programs that are currently authorized. They have regulations for them. But what we don't yet know is how are they going to manage this pot of money with the criteria required by Congress around climate change type practices and, manage that with the existing programs and funding. Again, it's both a big help and also a new set of challenges to do so. But clearly, Congress is saying that the new funding, the appropriated Inflation Reduction Act funding, is limited to a subset of practices that are getting funding under the mandatory Farm Bill CCC dollars. And so you separate those out and kind of work through those programs that have the climate change, that meet the climate change criteria, likely get funded out of the IRA, and all the other program practices in the program, that do not meet that criteria, then can get funded through the CCC dollars. That's kind of my rough sense of it. A lot still to be learned about how NRCS is going to implement it. But ultimately, what we're doing is just kind of splitting these practices into two basic categories, and each category has sort of priority funding. So if it's a climate change related practice, it gets, it prioritizes through the Inflation Reduction Act funds. If it's any of the other practices that don't meet that criteria, then they go through the CCC dollars. All right, next question. Hopefully that helps. Again, a lot to still be determined in operation. Can we walk through experience of how CBO determines the difference in authorization versus outlay? Oh, this is, here's somebody that's read CBO scores a few times. I think this is one of the wonderful mysteries of this whole process for scoring and estimating spending. What this refers to is if you look at conservation title program baseline, there are two, in all the CBO baseline, there are two categories of spending. There is the budget authority for the program, and then there are the outlays. The outlays are the actual estimated amounts that are spent. And many of the conservation programs, especially EQIP, has this gap. So the EQIP program may be authorized at $2 billion a fiscal year, but CBO is estimating that only 1.6 billion of it is actually an outlay. So that's what is the baseline as the actual expenditure, and that's the baseline that counts for a farm bill. So while you might have 2 billion written in the statute, it may only be 1.6 in the baseline. And that's a significant amount of difference over a 10-year window, obviously. The reason for that is basically that CBO has looked at the historic gap between actual spending and what was authorized and just said that, NRCS is not spending to the budget authority. I don't know the reasons for that, to be perfectly honest. I think there's a lot of complexity. We think about backlogs and other issues, so I'm sure there are multiple sort of complexities and challenges for NRCS in operating the programs and sticking within the budget authority. I don't know how much that kind of is used as a reserve to make sure they don't exceed budget authority. So I don't have a great answer to it. It's just one of the challenges we've seen with the way these programs operate. And I also don't know how that will apply to this Inflation Reduction Act funding. Will they use the same kind of spend out rates and expect it to look very similar to the CCC dollars, or they expect it to be more or less? At this point, we don't know. In fact, we're waiting to see CBO update its estimates, and hopefully we can provide some more information on that when we know more. All right, that is, let's see, next question we have up here. And Krista, maybe you can help out with this one a little bit. Sorry for the long, long dissertation on CBO and budget items. But question we have is, other than possible reduction in medical expenses, how does this legislation reduce inflation given fiscal stimulus? So here we have a question about the title. I don't know if Krista, you want to try to take this or other than reducing medical expenses. We have a pretty significant reduction in deficit. I mean, that's one aspect of it. If we think about the inflationary pressures from gasoline and fuel, I mean, we are looking at alternative sources, right? We're investing in new sources of energy that may help. Other thoughts, Krista, you might have on that?
I mean, not really much to add to what you've already said. I mean, I guess, like you mentioned, reducing the budget deficit is one way that it will help. But beyond that, I guess maybe there would have been more. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say here, but
that's all right. It's a tough question. I mean, it really.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my personal opinion is that it maybe was a little bit inappropriately named, or a better name could have been selected, but so maybe that would be the way that I would explain it. But anyway.
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I think certainly the reduction in Medicare costs will help. And again, I sort of look at a lot of this investment around things like alternative fuels and renewable energy sources, helping with the cost of energy, which is probably the biggest driver of inflation, particularly gasoline. I mean, we certainly see the impact that oil and gasoline has on inflation. So getting alternatives like electric vehicles, like the potential for hydrogen, but renewable energy sources. So your electric bill. I think of things like the $9.7 billion invested in rural electricity co-ops as another way to help them progress through adopting renewable energy and improving resiliency around climate change issues. So all of that can help reduce the cost of energy, reduce your electric bill maybe down the road. So that could be part of the argument from Congress. But I think it's a good question, but it's a tough one. And maybe we leave it there as to individual opinions about what you think the title is. But we do appreciate everybody joining us here this morning to talk Inflation Reduction Act, and frankly, appreciate just sticking with us through some thick legislative and budgetary specifics. So with that, if you have future questions, always let us know. You can find this information up on FarmDoc, on the FarmDoc website as part of the FarmDoc project, future articles on FarmDoc Daily, and the YouTube channel, which will keep this presentation up and available for those who want to go back over it and sort some things out. Other than that, we hope you have a great day, a great weekend. For those of you in the fields, be safe and good luck with harvest. We appreciate you taking some time here with us this morning. Have a good one.